Welcome to Silent Screams, where darkness, whispers, and terror await you. Are you ready to confront your fears? Story 1: The Specter of the Azure Queen. The sea was unnaturally calm that night. A thick mist rolled over the waves, swallowing the horizon. As Captain Elias Grayson stood at the helm of the Silver Tide, his weathered hands gripped the wheel tightly. The crew, a ragtag group of seasoned sailors, was uncharacteristically silent. They all felt it, that creeping unease, like icy fingers brushing the back of their necks. "Captain," whispered Nolan, the ship's navigator, his voice trembling, "we shouldn't be here. This is the Veil." The Veil. A stretch of open ocean avoided by even the bravest mariners. Stories of the Azure Queen, a ghostly vessel that lured ships to their doom, had haunted these waters for centuries. But Captain Grayson wasn't one for superstition. He needed to deliver his cargo on time. And cutting through the veil shaved days off the journey. "What's the matter, Nolan? Scared of shadows and whispers?" Grayson scoffed, though he couldn't shake the strange weight pressing on his chest. The crew muttered prayers under their breath as the Silver Tide sliced through the fog. The air grew colder, and an unnatural silence enveloped the ship. Even the waves seemed to retreat, leaving the vessel adrift in an eerie stillness. Then, in the distance, they saw it. A faint glow piercing through the mist, shimmering like moonlight on water. The Azure Queen. Chapter 1: A Phantom on the Horizon. The glowing silhouette of the Azure Queen grew clearer as the crew strained their eyes. Its once proud masts stood splintered, sails tattered like shredded lace. The hull gleamed with an otherworldly light, and the air around it shimmered as though the ship were caught between worlds. "We should turn back," muttered Nolan, clutching his compass. The needle spun wildly, unable to find true north. "Hold steady," Grayson commanded, though his voice lacked its usual authority. He couldn't explain it, but he felt drawn to the ghostly vessel. A strange melody, barely audible, seemed to hum through the fog, beckoning them closer. As they neared, the crew began to see shadowy figures on the deck of the Azure Queen. They moved with an unnatural fluidity, their forms flickering like candlelight. Suddenly, a piercing scream erupted from the crow's nest. It was Jacob, the lookout. "They're watching us," he yelled before collapsing in a fit of violent convulsions. By the time the crew reached him, his eyes were blank, his body cold. "What happened to him?" one sailor whispered. "He saw something he wasn't meant to," Nolan replied grimly, clutching a silver pendant around his neck. The melody grew louder, wrapping itself around the crew's minds like a vice. It wasn't beautiful, it was haunting, discordant, like a lullaby sung by the damned. One by one, the crew began to succumb. Davis, the ship's cook, walked off the deck as if in a trance, vanishing into the misty waters below. Others began whispering to unseen figures, their eyes glazed over. Grayson fought to keep control. "Snap out of it," he shouted, shaking Nolan, who had begun muttering incoherently. But even Grayson felt the pull. The song clawed at his thoughts, promising him glory, wealth, and the answers to questions he had long buried. As they drew closer to the Azure Queen, the ship seemed to come alive. Chains dangled from its sides like skeletal hands, and the air filled with the sound of creaking wood and phantom laughter. Desperate for answers, Grayson ordered the ship to anchor near the Azure Queen. He and a small group of the remaining crew boarded the ghost ship. The deck was slick with brine and decay. A faint glow illuminated the figures they had seen earlier, phantoms of sailors long dead. Their hollow eyes fixed on Grayson. At the center of the deck stood a woman. Her figure wrapped in a shimmering, ethereal gown. Her face was both beautiful and horrifying. Her eyes pools of darkness. "I am Celeste, Queen of the Azure," she said. Her voice resonating with the weight of centuries. "You've come seeking what lies beyond. Captain Grayson. Are you prepared to pay the price?" "What price?" Grayson demanded, though fear gripped his heart. Celeste smiled, revealing sharp, bone-white teeth. "Your soul, Captain. For the treasures of the deep and the secrets of eternity. Your soul will suffice." Grayson hesitated. Behind him, the crew began to wail as the shadows of the Azure Queen closed in. Grayson refused the bargain. But it was too late. Celeste's laughter echoed as the silver tide began to crumble, its crew consumed by the spectral horrors of the Azure Queen. Grayson awoke alone, adrift on a piece of wreckage. The Azure Queen was gone. But her song lingered in the wind. The ocean was still. Unnaturally so. Years later, sailors would tell tales of the silver tide and its doomed voyage through the veil. Some claim to have seen Captain Grayson's ghost, forever chasing the Azure Queen, his soul trapped in an eternal pursuit. The sea kept its secrets. But one thing was certain: those who ventured into the veil never returned whole. Story 2: The Phantom of the Black Horizon. It was an old sailor's tale, whispered in dimly lit taverns and shared over weathered maps. The Black Horizon, a vessel believed to have vanished in 1784, was said to reappear under moonless skies, its decayed sails billowing in an unnatural wind. No one who encountered the ghost ship ever lived to recount their tale. Or so the stories went. When the aging fishing trawler Eleanor's Grace received a distress call from coordinates deep in the Atlantic, the crew of 5, Captain Meredith, First Mate Jack, Engineer Cole, Navigator Elena, and Deckhand Rory, dismissed the legends as mere superstitions. They were professionals, hardened by years at sea, and they owed it to the maritime code to investigate. But some mysteries are better left unsolved. The distress signal was faint, an almost indecipherable sequence of crackling words that chilled the air. To any vessel, adrift, lost, shadows, help us. Meredith squinted at the map spread across the table in the dimly lit cabin. The coordinates placed the source miles away from any known shipping routes. It was a no-man's land of endless waves and treacherous currents. "This doesn't feel right," Elena murmured, her fingers trembling slightly as she traced the line of the route. Jack scoffed. "It's probably a derelict freighter or a prank. Either way, we're going. People could be in trouble." Reluctantly, Meredith gave the order. The engines roared to life, and Eleanor's Grace began its journey into the unknown. As they approached the coordinates, a dense fog enveloped the ship. The air turned icy, and visibility dropped to mere feet. Rory, stationed at the bow, swore he saw figures moving in the mist. "Just your imagination," Cole muttered. But his own hands were white-knuckled on the railing. Then they saw it, emerging from the fog like a leviathan from the deep. The black horizon loomed before them. Its hull was blackened and rotting, yet eerily intact. Tattered sails flapped silently in the still air, and the faint sound of creaking wood echoed across the water. "What in God's name?" Jack whispered, his bravado gone. The distress signal blared again. Louder and clearer. "Come aboard, please." Against her better judgment, Meredith decided to investigate, leaving Rory to man the trawler. She led the others aboard the phantom vessel. The deck was slick with seaweed and encrusted with barnacles. Strange symbols were carved into the wood, glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. Inside, the air was thick with the stench of decay. They found no crew, only traces of them. A table set for dinner. Plates covered in mold. A journal, its pages soaked but still legible, described a descent into madness. The last entry read, "They come for us in the dark. They wear our faces." As they delved deeper, shadows seemed to move in the corners of their vision. The walls groaned as if alive. When they returned to the deck, the Eleanor's grace was gone. In its place was endless ocean. Panic set in. Cole screamed that he saw figures standing in the water, their glowing eyes fixed on the ship. Jack swore he heard the voices of his long-dead parents calling to him from below. The ship began to change. The wood pulsed like flesh, and the shadows grew bolder, taking forms, imitations of the crew. Meredith faced a twisted doppelganger of herself, its eyes hollow and its smile unnatural. Elena found the ship's bell, an ornate relic inscribed with the words, "To ring is to be freed." Desperate, she struck it. The sound was deafening, reverberating through their bones. The ship shuddered, and the shadows screamed, dissolving into mist. But as the fog cleared, they realized they were still aboard the Black Horizon, adrift in an ocean that stretched endlessly in every direction. One by one, the crew began to disappear. Rory was the first, snatched into the depths by a shadowy hand. Cole followed, consumed by the very walls of the ship. Meredith and Elena made a final, desperate attempt to escape. They found a lifeboat, but the moment they touched it, the shadows dragged it into the sea. "I think we were meant to find this," Elena whispered, her voice barely audible. "The Black Horizon doesn't want to be forgotten. It calls for the curious and the brave, to trap them here, forever." In the end, Meredith was alone. The last entry in her journal read, "If you find this, turn back. Do not answer the call. The Black Horizon waits for you, as it did for us." Years later, a fishing trawler found the Eleanor's Grace drifting near the Bermuda Triangle. The crew was missing, but the ship's logbook told the tale of the Black Horizon. When the trawler's captain heard the faint crackle of a distress call on the radio, he made the only sensible decision. He turned off the radio. Story 3: The Phantom's Tide. The vast expanse of the North Atlantic was a dark canvas that stretched endlessly under a moonless sky. Ethan Blake, a marine salvage expert, leaned against the rail of the Resolute, a weathered but reliable trawler. The crew had spent weeks chasing rumors of an elusive ship, a ghostly vessel that materialized under certain conditions before vanishing like a mirage. Locals in a nearby coastal town called it the Tempest's Bride, an ancient clipper ship said to have disappeared in a storm over a century ago. Stories spoke of cursed cargo, sailors' mutinies, and haunting wails that carried across the waves on stormy nights. Most dismissed the tales as folklore, but Ethan believed otherwise. His obsession wasn't just professional, it was personal. His father, a renowned marine archaeologist, had vanished while chasing the same legend years ago. This was Ethan's chance to uncover the truth. As the Resolute drifted in the frigid waters, the radar beeped erratically. "Ethan. You seeing this?" called out Mark. "The ship's navigator." Ethan stepped into the bridge, squinting at the screen. A large, stationary object appeared just a few nautical miles ahead, an anomaly in an otherwise barren stretch of ocean. No distress calls. No identifying signals. "It's her," Ethan whispered, his voice trembling with anticipation. The crew, skeptical but intrigued, adjusted their course. The wind howled as the temperature dropped unnaturally. Soon, a faint silhouette emerged on the horizon, a towering ship with torn sails and a skeletal mast. It didn't look like it belonged to this century, or this world. Against the crew's protests, Ethan insisted they board the ghostly vessel. A small team, including Ethan, Mark, and 2 deckhands, approached in a motorized dinghy. As they drew closer, the ship loomed above them like a monolithic tomb. The stench of salt and decay greeted them as they climbed aboard. The deck was eerily intact, yet covered in a thin layer of frost despite the lack of ice in the surrounding waters. Strange symbols were etched into the wooden planks, spiraling toward the main mast. "Feels like a graveyard," muttered Mark, his flashlight beam flickering as if unwilling to pierce the ship's darkness. Ethan's attention was drawn to the captain's quarters. Inside, a table was set for a feast long forgotten, tarnished silverware, mold-covered plates, and a single goblet filled with what looked like blood. The air was heavy, almost sentient. Then, they heard it, a low, guttural moan that seemed to emanate from the bowels of the ship. Ethan found a logbook in the captain's desk. Its pages yellowed but legible. The final entry, dated 1872, spoke of a shipment bound for an unnamed port. The cargo was described only as the artifact, a relic purchased from a strange man at an island bazaar. The entry grew frantic. "The crew is restless. They whisper of shadows moving below deck. 3 men are missing. We must cast it overboard. But the storms are relentless. We are trapped." A scream interrupted Ethan's reading. He bolted from the room to find one of the deckhands standing at the edge of the ship, staring into the dark waters below. "They're calling me," he murmured before stepping over the edge. The splash echoed in the silence, but his body never surfaced. Panic spread among the crew. Mark pulled Ethan aside. "We need to leave. This ship isn't just haunted, it's alive." But Ethan was unrelenting. "We need to find the artifact. That's the key to all of this." Descending into the ship's lower levels, the air grew colder. Lanterns sputtered as if the ship itself resisted their presence. The walls were lined with crates, but one stood out, a blackened chest bound in rusted chains. Ethan pried it open, revealing an ornate, obsidian idol carved into the shape of a serpent coiled around a human skull. The artifact pulsed faintly, emitting a sound just below the threshold of hearing. Suddenly, the ship lurched violently, and the floorboards creaked as if in agony. Ethan clutched the idol, his heart racing. "We need to get out of here," shouted Mark. But it was too late. The shadows came alive, forming humanoid shapes with hollow eyes and twisted limbs. They advanced, their whispers growing into deafening wails. Ethan and Mark ran toward the deck, pursued by the shadows. The remaining deckhand was gone, claimed by the ship. As they reached the dinghy, the waters churned violently, forming a massive whirlpool around the Tempest's bride. "Throw it back," Mark screamed, gesturing to the idol. Ethan hesitated. torn between his father's obsession and the horror unfolding around him. The shadows closed in, their touch icy and paralyzing. With a final cry, Ethan hurled the artifact into the whirlpool. The shadows paused, their forms dissolving into the air. The ship groaned as if in relief, then began to sink, dragged into the depths by the vortex. Ethan and Mark barely made it back to the Resolute, watching as the Tempest's bride disappeared beneath the waves, taking its cursed legacy with it. Weeks later, Ethan returned to the coastal town, the events aboard the ghost ship haunting his dreams. In the local tavern, an old fisherman approached him. "You saw her, didn't you?" he asked, his voice trembling. Ethan nodded. The man leaned in, his breath reeking of alcohol. "They always come back.